time with you all. My name is Tracy Wright. I work here at NCCASA. Oh, we still got friends showing up. Look at this. Y'all are amazing. Like in a virtual conference, y'all still coming through and want to learn and be in this amazing space that clearly, as you all can tell, I am so excited to have our amazing speakers and speakers. We do have a speaker who's going to join us a little later, but I'm excited that we get a chance to talk about this. Like, this is emergent space. I keep one on my person at all times. Like, I'm so excited for you all to be. There we go. All right, our speaker keep one on her person at all times too. For you all to come into this space and hear from pure brilliance from young people who are truly the leaders in this space. I have a great affinity for Shireen, who is a senior studying political science, political public policy and political science with a minor in Hispanic studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She is the co-president of a peer education program called Healthy Heals Ambassador, a Moxie scholar, and she's especially passionate about wellness, violence prevention, advocacy, and centering marginalized voices. We'll also be joined by Mantia, who is also another junior, is also another student from UNC Chapel Hill. She's a double major, minor in women's studies and gender studies and media and journalism. Just really, really bright and brilliant folks. And I'm just excited that we get a chance to open up the space with Shireen. Guys, let me tell you about Shireen. Shireen is an alumni of NC Young Advocates Institute. And so I just love sharing that every time we get a chance. I get a chance to be in space with her about the full circle. And now she's back. And she's going to lead us and guide us into emergent space. Shireen, you got it, boo.
Yes, thank you so much, Tracy. It's such an honor to always be in spaces with you and be introduced by you, especially as you've been a mentor. As Tracy mentioned, I was in YI years ago, and it's amazing to come back to NCCASA. I actually interned for NCCASA through the Moxie program that Tracy mentioned over the summer with Montia, and that's kind of how I came back, ended back up at NCCASA. But it's been an experience of a lifetime. It's been such a blessing, and I finally felt like, wow, I actually have a platform where folks will actually listen to me and, take my ideas as, real solid ideas. And so it's been an amazing opportunity, and I'm just so honored to be here today with y'all. I'm so excited too. So with that, we're probably going to pull up the slides. As Tracy mentioned, Montia is going to be joining us. Of course, Montia and Chris are my co-authors of the Emergent Space Framework, which we will delve into really soon. I'm super excited.
So we're having a little technical difficulties. So Shireen, while I figure this out, I made you a co-host. You can go ahead and share your screen to pull up your slides while I work on this in the background. You all know how technology is. You think you got it all set up. You've tried it a million times. But when we're talking about emergent space, you know what that requires us to be, guys? Guess what? Flexible.
Absolutely.
Right? There we go.
Absolutely. We're going to go right into the elements. I love that, Tracy. Yes. One of the elements, as you will know, is adaptability. And so we are going to be as adaptable as possible, which is really, really necessary, I think, for spaces in virtual settings. So I'm going to try to share my screen, y'all. Can everyone see my screen all right? And also, I want to give folks the opportunity to make this, especially since we're a smaller group, which I honestly can appreciate, because that means that folks can actually contribute and hopefully speak, and hopefully we can create an emergent space today of some sort. So folks, feel free to unmute your mics at any point, or if you want to have your video camera on, I'd love that too. But yeah, we just want to have this conversation with y'all about emergent spaces. So Here is the presentation. Hopefully y'all can see. So essentially, emergent spaces, why a new framework, right? And so I'm wondering, has anyone in this space heard of a safe space or a brave space before, just in conversation or something that's been brought up, I don't know, at your organization? Chats, yeah. Okay, folks are saying yes. All right, so that's great to hear. I want to hear and challenge folks to think. Let's start with a safe space. What about a safe space do y'all think might maybe need a improvement, or where's there an opportunity to maybe improve something in a safe space? Or have you ever been in a safe space that hasn't felt so safe? Or what are some things maybe that you might change about the safe spaces you've been in? Does anyone have any ideas about that? We can't guarantee that the space is safe. Absolutely. Thank you, Sharika. Yes. That's 100% true. That's actually one of the first thoughts that Montia and I had as students about safe space, particularly too as it related to our marginalized identities, because a lot of the time, right, safe spaces are kind of meant to seem like they're just this all-encompassing environment that no one gets harmed in the space and everyone's supposed to be completely comfortable and feeling great at all times. And I think if we think about it realistically, that doesn't always happen, right? Yeah. Margaret said that it limits people from pushing themselves to challenge their own problematic thinking. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. It definitely, I think, encourages that sense of like essentially relying on others or relying on the rest of the group to kind of do that internal self work that needs to be done before one even gets to the space, right? Which actually ends up causing harm a lot of the time and not making it a safe space. Absolutely. Exactly. Who deems them safe? Really great point, Annie. That's another thought that we had, again, especially thinking about marginalized folks in spaces, folks with, marginalized identities, how in a space, yeah, is it safe? Is it safe for who, right? Is it safe for the folks who might be having to do undue emotional labor or have that burden, right? That's not necessarily safe in a space. And yeah, it doesn't allow room for varying perspectives or even really conflict, right? I mean, I think when we think of conflict, we think it's necessarily like a con, but we're going to go into it later into this presentation of how actually conflict can be generative and conflict is almost inevitable, right? And in our organizations or whenever we're working with teams, because we all are bringing different lived experiences, perspectives to spaces. So inherently there would be conflict that's occurring, but that conflict doesn't necessarily have to be bad. It can actually be generative and a place for growth and innovation. Yeah, these are all great. So a lot of these cons, I would say, of safe spaces is essentially like why we were like, okay, maybe we need to take a step back from safe spaces and think of something that would be, would address a lot of these cons that we were talking about. So quickly, just moving on to Brave Space. Thank you so much, y'all, by the way, for participating in the chat. What about Brave Spaces to y'all seems kind of like, I don't know if this is Brave Space. I don't know if this is really conducive to growth. What might not be conducive to growth in a brave space? Unproductive conflict, absolutely. And shame, yes. Yes. Yeah, definitely in brave spaces. Who gets to define what a brave space? Exactly. Again, who gets to define all of these things in both spaces, right? It seems like the responsibility almost falls on one person or one facilitator or one leader to make sure that the safe is either space or brave or running as it's supposed to. Belittling, lack of civility, exactly. Okay, so that's when we're coming into, right, this sort of unproductive, harmful kind of conflict, right? When we don't have that way of generative conflict, we go the opposite direction that becomes harmful, right? Maybe in the form of belittling or that lack of civility that y'all are mentioning in the chat. Absolutely. It can make it so that folks are, butting heads. And also, again, thinking about marginalized folks, a lot of time in brave spaces, it requires folks to overshare or share, again, their own emotional labor, own lived experiences that might, come with that emotional labor that more folks have to do rather than others, which can cause harm. And so with those thoughts in mind, that's really why we came up with this new framework. Sorry, y'all, I'm trying to do this. Okay, there we go. And so, yes, what kind of inspired us and kind of a little bit of background and story behind it is that over the summer, my mentor and coach, Caress at UNC, gave me this book, Emergent Strategy, which is written by Adrienne Maree Brown. And Emergent Strategy is really what shaped and laid the groundwork for our framework. And essentially, it inspired us to think, how can we organize ourselves in a way that's different? And Emergent Strategy talks a lot about the different elements, frameworks, and ways of organizing on a more societal/community level. But essentially what we did is we thought, okay, this works great on a community level, and this is where we want to move forward. But how do we essentially do this on a more personal or individual or group-based level? And so this is how we came up with the idea of an emergent space rather than a safe space and brave space. And so we just wanted to shout out to Adrienne Maree Brown because there's a new book coming, and also a book she just published recently was Pleasure Activism, which is something I've heard really great things about. But another book will be coming out in April, Holding Change, The Way of Emergent Strategy, Facilitation, and Mediation. So we just want to recommend for folks who haven't read Emergent Strategy yet, but also being aware of all of these other great frameworks and ideas and books that Adrienne Maree Brown is coming up with that completely complement a lot of this framework, and also just the way we organize in general, that I think is super useful. Let me check the chat real quick. I see some things popping up. What a jewel of a book, absolutely. And yes, it is a part of NCCASA's library if y'all want to check it out. And yeah, We Will Not Cancel Us. Thank you so much. That's another great book that Adrienne Maree Brown has written recently that a lot of folks also appreciate. So yeah, just an amazing author. Definitely one of the inspirations I look towards in my life. So going into it, here are the principles of emergent strategy. I'm just going to list them real quick, but we're going to go into each and every one of them a little bit more in depth. The first one is that emergent strategy has a fractal nature, which means that it acknowledges the relationships between small and large scales. It's adaptive. It emphasizes interdependence and decentralization. It's non-linear and iterative, and it fosters resilience and transformative justice. And the last element is that it continues to create more possibilities, which is, if you think about it, a lot of what this whole framework and how it came to be is, because Adrienne Maree Brown built off, other scholars, right, to create these ideas of emergent strategies. And then we're building off Adrienne Maree Brown to do essentially the same thing. And that means that every single person in the space too can take this knowledge, take this information, and build off of it even more in their own respective communities. And then that, as you'll see, can have a fractal nature. It can become adaptive. It just makes it so that there are wide scale shifts going on, both on the small and on the large scale, that can make this framework really, really powerful and productive. So the first element, as I mentioned, is that emergent spaces and emergent strategy has a fractal nature. And so I really like this image. It's a kaleidoscope. And if you can see, each part essentially is an essential part, even the smallest parts of it. And each small part, fractal, we'll call them fractals, each small fractal has an immediate effect on the fractals around them. So we can think of this as our actions and the way we navigate throughout the world, the way we move, has different effects on the world around us. And we are constantly shifting, which means that those shifts are inherently also creating bigger shifts on the outside. So if we think about creating these patterns on a small scale, whether that be me deciding I'm going to start doing the self-work, I'm going to try to start putting emergent strategy into practice in my life, that's going to create shifts in my life, right? But that might also create shifts around the spaces that I'm in, whether that be with my family or with my friends or in my workspace. And those shifts, as they happen, even on a small scale, can lead to greater shifts on the larger scale. And so that's what the fractal nature kind of addresses.
Ooh, isn't that a beautiful thing to realize and kind of sit with? Shireen, like that's what we really should all be trying to do, right? And how things build up off each other. Ooh,
Absolutely.
that was aha for me. I learned something new every time y'all come through and do this. I done sat through this a couple times. Folks, like tell us what is, resonating. And we just got into the first piece, right? Anything resonating with folks you want to drop in the chat?
And like I said, folks, feel free to unmute, feel free to make this as
Yeah.
much as a conversation. Like we said, I love creating emergent spaces. I love creating emergent spaces. And if anything, it's almost like presenting sometimes can almost move us away from the kind of emergent space, but definitely taking on this role of, all of us are learning in this space together and taking things out of it. And every time I do it too, I learn something. And I think that's just the nature of this framework. So yeah, I just want to encourage y'all to do that. All right, so the next element is that, oops, my bad, y'all. The next element is that it's adaptive. So just like what I did, you can revisit and come back, and everything about spaces a lot of the time is that, things change, right? And so inherently, if things are changing, then I think it's most best that we are adaptive to those changes. And so folks in the space are ready for change, whether that be right on the individual level and societal level. So I think a lot of the time, especially when we think about nonprofits or systems or businesses or just these big scale systems and institutions, it's really easy to get comfortable, I think, in the norm. It's really easy to adhere to what's been normalized for so long and kind of what's been static, that it's kind of hard or uncomfortable a lot of the time when we have to change or when we have to adapt. I think we've gotten very uncomfortable in that. But one thing I love to reiterate to folks is that I think that a lot of change and growth actually happens in a lot of that discomfort. And so being able to be adaptive, both as a facilitator or someone who takes up space, can really lead to a lot of fruitful conversations. Or it can look like, revisiting something that you talked about in the first part of your presentation or discussion and revisiting at the end. Or it just allows you to be adaptive to make sure that you're getting everything out of the space that, could possibly come out of the space, which might not happen if that space was just so static and it was just like linear, right? From point A to point B, we're just going to get here with no room to go everywhere else and explore all the other possibilities, right? So the next element is interdependence and decentralization. So for me personally, this is one of my favorite elements because it really helps me wrap around my head about how we organize and thinking about systems. Just think about it. I feel like in a lot of institutions, and you can think about whatever institution you might be tied to. I think about my university, for example. There's a lot of hierarchy. There's so much hierarchy everywhere, right? And usually we know there's an exec, there's the president, there's the person at the top making a lot of the executive decision. But we challenge that and we say, what would happen if we were to bring more spaces onto an equitable playing field to essentially be a part of that decision-making process and be a part of the change, being a part of the movement. And so creating a space where we're actually interdependent on one another rather than just putting a responsibility on one or two or even a small group of people to essentially hold the vision of the rest of the space, I think is very counterproductive. And even thinking about how we can, again, include marginalized folks into spaces more, interdependence and decentralization really gives us the flexibility to do so because we're moving away from these stagnant hierarchies and more so moving towards community and collaboration and taking individual responsibility to hold up that space. I want to go back because I think I saw something in the chat pop up, but I'm trying to navigate all these things at once. So bear with me, but thank you for your patience, y'all. Tracy, I'm not able to see the chat. Is there anything in the chat? There we go. Yeah, I just want to go back to the chat because I see that some folks wrote, whiteness as a system has convinced us to be rigid, which is not human. Nature reminds us that everything is changing. Yes, absolutely. That is, I have to give snaps to that. I really appreciate that comment because, like we said, Adrienne Maree Brown, actually, the whole point of a lot of the book in Emergent Strategy is biomimicry, which essentially means that she's, thinking about nature and thinking about how we can apply, the way we organize to the way nature organizes. Yes, nature. I'm seeing nature being put into the chat. That really is like a guiding factor. And one of the things that struck me when I first read it was like this idea of like ants, for example, and how ants are so interdependent and they rely on each other to make sure that their community is not only surviving, but thriving. And so thinking about nature as essentially almost like a blueprint for how we can organize, I think is a really cool thing. And that's what a lot of this framework does. Putting adaptivity into practice also means the participant must do the work outside of emergent space. Yes, big one, snaps to that as well, because one of the things we're going to go into too is this idea of self-work. And so I haven't really necessarily mentioned that before, but when we were thinking about a lot of the cons, right, of safe space and brave space, it kind of just allowed folks to come into the space without really considering their own reflections, their own power, their own privilege, their own lived experiences. Without doing that, you're bringing a bunch of unconscious folks right into a space. And with that kind of unconsciousness, right, can come a lot of harm. And so I think being conscious, and especially on the individual level, of one's own self-work and one's own understanding of these systems of power before they even come into the space can make the space so much more productive and fruitful than if otherwise they hadn't done that. So I think essentially like making sure that we're stressing, right, that importance of self-work that's not actually stressed in a lot of the safe space or brave space curriculum is something that we're really trying to also push for in this framework. So I'm glad that y'all are, putting that in the chat, because that's exactly where we're going. So yeah, the next element is that it's non-linear and iterative. Like I said, we're not just going from point A to B and that's like just the whole meeting, right? The way I imagine it is that a conversation just flows the way naturally it wants to go. And as humans, we're putting our humanity first in these spaces, not our productivity, right? Or what we're going to necessarily produce out of it or get out of it. I mean, obviously we want to get something out of it, but we're putting our human selves in the space first to see, okay, what healing needs to be done? What are folks bringing to the space? And considering that before even considering anything else is important, I think. And so this idea of it also being iterative, like you're able to adapt, you're able to change, you're able to return to the space and understand that, the space won't be the same every single time, and that's completely okay. And also understanding too, when we're thinking about violence prevention specifically and thinking about trauma and healing is super nonlinear. So why would we expect healing to be linear in the spaces we're creating too, right? So making sure that we're acknowledging that. Another extremely important element of emergent spaces and also emergent strategy is the idea of transformative justice as a centering value, and also the importance of resilience. And so again, marginalized folks, LGBTQ plus folks, survivors of violence, people of color, all of these different marginalized groups and identities a lot of the time end up, like I said, getting harmed in a lot of spaces. And I think a lot of our traditional institutions, and like I said, the institutions and systems that we've normalized have very punitive methods of dealing with trauma, dealing with violence, dealing with harm. And I'm talking police, prisons, government, to address those individual harm. And a lot of the time, right, they're on a legal basis anyways. A lot of the time they don't necessarily address the humanity side of what goes on in trauma and healing and violence. So thinking about how we can maybe move away from those punitive systems to more comprehensive and healing and transformative justice, ways of dealing with trauma and harm in a way that, again, centers marginalized folks, the folks that essentially have a lot of these experiences. And so the last element, as I mentioned earlier, was the idea of creating more possibilities. So the idea of these emergent spaces, that they're really supposed to be creating more and more possibilities, because it is supposed to encourage innovation inherently, just because of the collaborative nature from it, the nature that it challenges traditional norms and expectations. And what thing I love about emergent strategy and just emergent space in general, and I think a lot of folks in NCCASA have kind of echoed this, which has really brought joy to my heart, is the fact that people are really bringing this framework not only into their institutions or their nonprofits or their workspace, they're bringing it into their personal lives. Like they're applying it to their relationships and how they interact with others and how they interact with people that they're even close to. So I think that the possibilities for this framework are so endless and applicable to so many different spaces. And we just encourage that, whatever you take from it, you can continue to build and grow on from it, because there's still so much that can be done. And so now thinking about conflict, we definitely talked about conflict and addressed that early on, which I appreciate. We're now going to go back to that. And so generative conflict, you can see on the left, and we have counterproductive conflict on the right. So I'm actually going to start with counterproductive conflict because I feel like that's a lot of the conflict I've personally witnessed, seen, and been a part of in a lot of the spaces I've traditionally been in. And so counterproductive conflict can look like people in the space prioritizing being right or proving others wrong as the goal. And I think a lot of us might be able to think of a time when this is the case, where it's really just about, okay, who has the best idea, or whose organization is going to come on top, or no, I just want to like prove them wrong, right? So that's not generative at all. That just leads to not really creating a solution. If anything, it leads to more conflict and more harm. Counterproductive conflict also loses sight of collaboration, and it also causes participants, like those, especially with those who have marginalized identities, to feel unheard and unseen. A lot of the time that's what we're specifically talking about in safe and brave spaces, and a lot of the counterproductive conflict that folks were talking about, right, where marginalized folks would get harmed because they have to overshare, or one person has to take all the responsibility for the space, or people feel guilt or shame, and all of these other things. And then the last point is that it's just not solution oriented. How can it be solution oriented if these are the kinds of values, or these are the kinds of dynamics, right, that we're working with? But the good news is that we have generative conflict. And like I said, conflict doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. It doesn't have to be negative. Something positive can surely come out of it. And so emergent spaces aims to have more generative conflict by holding repair and growth as goals and ideals, rather than holding being right as an ideal. Secondly, it's between people who are actually collaborating towards a greater understanding, and equity. That part, and equity, is super important, and who listen and hear each other. And so this point is especially important when we're thinking again about marginalized folks and marginalized identities feeling heard, right, and listened to. But in order for that to happen, there has to be that amount of understanding, right? There has to be that mutual understanding in the space, that everyone comes to the space having already done the self-work and having already educated themselves about systems of power, systems of privilege, transformative justice, right? All of these things that can make the space so much more collaborative, right? And so much more just community-based, because too, when we come in with a mutual understanding, especially of systems, especially of equity, right? Everyone can feel heard, everyone can feel seen, and therefore everyone can actually feel a responsibility to collaborate in the space. And again, this makes it so that the space becomes solution-oriented rather than not solution-oriented. So I think there was something in the chat, so let me see if I can pull that up. I don't know why sometimes like it lets me see it and then sometimes it doesn't. It's not popping up immediately. I'm just going to go ahead and delve into accessibility, but as soon as I can look at the chat, I'm definitely going to address it because I want to definitely hear what y'all think. It's super important. So another concept that we want to bring in, especially as it ties to emergent spaces, is acknowledging accessibility. I think a lot of the time it's easy to forget about accessibility, especially when a lot of the folks in the spaces have particular privileges, right? And so thinking about, oops, sorry, y'all. Let me go back. Technologically, oops, this is going forward. There we go, adaptability, here we go, back at it. Accessibility, so thinking about, again, our own privileges. It's easy to, like for me, for example, to maybe not consider, oh my gosh, is the space that I'm meeting in for school like accessible to folks who you know might need a wheelchair accessible entrance, for example. That might not be something that we think about immediately, but it's still so important. What about language accessibility, right? So thinking about all of these things and making sure that your space acknowledges this, right? So that folks, again, aren't left with certain privileges over others, and that everyone can feel, again, safe, heard, and seen in the space is super important. Another key concept, and this is important in public health and violence prevention, is just evaluation. So establishing a plan, I think, for what space you're trying to create is super important. So thinking about, okay, what kind of space am I trying to create to begin with? So that initial reflection, and then even documenting how then you implemented that space, and then being able, and this is an iterative nature, right, an adaptable nature too, to be able to go back and think about, okay, what was the outcomes? What was the actual impact of the space that I created? And then therefore evaluate, did my intention of this space match the impact of this space? And being able to hold that space to have those evaluations and then have that adaptability, right? To be able to go ahead and change things. Okay, next time I'm gonna maybe try to have the space this way, or I'm gonna hold the space in a way that's different so that maybe another outcome can happen, for example. And so I like this visual. It kind of shows the iterative, I think, and almost cyclical nature of group processes and stages, especially as they relate to creating emergent spaces. And so again, we're beginning right with centering the values, centering the goals. We begin with a common understanding and self-work before we even enter the space. And that inherently helps us to build trust, to build community, and we have a set of shared values and agreements that we can continue to move towards and hopefully be solution oriented towards. And so the next step of actually implementing, actually doing, putting those values, putting those understandings into action becomes norming and performing and practicing those emergent spaces. And then we can go back, just like in evaluations, we're closing the process, we're evaluating how did it go, and now we're thinking of how do we create more possibilities? Those are the next steps and new spaces. And just like seeds and just like planting, you're continuing to plant, to harvest, and to regrow. And that's essentially very similar to what we're trying to do with emergent spaces. And so this is sort of new. We are thinking of how to apply emergent spaces to the bystander model. And so how many folks are familiar? Is everyone more or less familiar with the bystander model and what that means when I'm referring to it? Great, I'm getting a few yeses in the chat. Awesome. So essentially thinking about the bystander intervention model, this is a model that's been used that I have personally even taught as a peer educator. It used to be one act in the curriculum I knew, where is essentially trying to have bystander intervention. So someone intervening in a particular situation that seems unsafe or that could lead to an outcome of harm, to try and prevent that from actually happening by having some sort of intervention or stepping in somehow. And so there are lots of trainings and workshops and models, right, that kind of teach people, okay, how do I be a bystander? How do I intervene as a bystander? And so thinking about that, we'd actually like to reimagine the bystander model using emergent spaces by really centering community, by really centering the changing of norms and the changing of larger culture. And so I'm going to get into what I mean by that. So let's start with some of the challenges. And a lot of these challenges, I have personally witnessed, at my university and just in general of bystander models. So one is that often a lot of the bystander models are targeted to privileged populations, especially when thinking about violence prevention, for example. A lot of the trainings and models are very white-centered. They're heteronormative, and a lot of the role play examples happen to be that way too. And so, for example, when I was in the space, when I was at my university thinking about violence prevention and sexual assault, for example, a lot of the examples that I would hear, right, are about maybe fraternity and sorority life, right? And, you're at a party and some harm might be happening. How are you going to intervene in that party? The problem is, though, I can never imagine myself in that space. So what am I supposed to do in those models? So again, thinking about who these frameworks are applying to, understanding the privileges and the nuances of power behind them and who creates them. Again, labor and work falling upon the most marginalized folks in the space. And again, can reiterate this, that in those types of spaces, right, a lot of the time, I've noticed that, for example, women in a lot of these spaces, even in fraternity and sorority life, it's the women that are actually doing the push, that's doing the pushing towards, we need more violence prevention training, we need more training on consent, whereas a lot of the male identified fraternities, you know, are kind of sitting on a more passive and kind of like, well, we'll just, you know, we'll get our boxes checked that we did the trainings, but we're not really into it. We don't really care about changing larger culture, right? So thinking about where that labor usually falls. Again, the reliance on an individual effort rather than community accountability. And so this is inherent. If you know the bystander model, you also know the bystander effect. And so the bystander effect, I just want to explain it real quick so folks were on the same page, is essentially when there's, again, a harm about to happen and someone in the space, essentially there are multiple people, right, witnessing that something is about to happen, but the bystander effect means that everyone else in that space has the thought, someone else is going to deal with it. Someone else sees it, so they're going to deal with it. But then it creates this community non-accountability where no one intervenes. And so that creates the harm, right? And so that's the bystander effect. And so how does that happen? It happens because responsibility is placed on the individual to take action rather than on the actual community, on the actual larger society to take responsibility and hold each other accountable for when harm happens. And then lastly, it focuses on the event only as it happens and not the events or norms leading up to the violence. And that's so important with prevention, right? And so, of course, it's not to say that it's helpful and it's important to, of course, try to intervene when we see some sort of harm happening. But it's also, I think, important to consider, what are the events leading up to that harm? What even caused that harm to even be possible in the first place? And so a lot of bystander models don't even address that. So how can we center emergent space then in a bystander model? And so these are the 4 main points that we came up with, which is 1, love led by community accountability. And that goes to what I was talking about of like the bystander effects, for example, whereas an individual might feel responsible. If we were to make shifts so that the actual community, everybody in that space felt a responsibility to act, then we might see different kinds of accountability. We might see shifts in larger culture and shifts in what's actually normalized and the kind of violence that's normalized. Again, transformative justice, super important in thinking about bystander intervention. Normally, a lot of the time, bystander interventions encourage the use of punitive measures. They kind of encourage this diffusion of responsibility onto police, onto prisons to say, okay, handle this, right? But that's not necessarily where we want to go, right? Because we know that a lot of folks do not find that to be helpful, do not find that to actually be a safe or healing process for them. Again, decentralization. So rather than focusing on just, okay, we're going to have one bystander, right? And it's that bystander's responsibility to do what they can to prevent this harm from happening. We now have a community of bystander who all feel well prepared, who all feel a calling and a responsibility to intervene, to act if something were to happen, right? And then that goes directly with interdependence of each of us as bystanders are dependent on one another, along especially with the person who's doing harm and even the person who's committing harm to be held accountable by other people. And so we're all holding each other accountable in this web almost of interdependence, but that requires that amount of decentralization and love and accountability. So all of these things really tie together in a beautiful way, which is why I love the image that goes with it. So thinking about sexual violence in particular, thinking about risk and protective factors as they're related to bystander intervention, some risk factors that we've thought about a lot and that we found to be pretty prominent in a lot of the readings were, you know, just a lack of empathy as a risk factor when harm occurs, and especially a hard adherence to gender norms, gender roles, which promotes, right, this acceptance of maybe unhealthy masculinities, for example, or men performing violence as an example. And so some protective factors on the flip side is the emotional health and connectedness that maybe one could get from a supportive community, for example, and empathy and concern for how one's actions affect others. So how can we think about these risk factors and protective factors as they relate to emergent strategy and emergent spaces? So one thing, definitely, I'm going to go back actually, since I asked that question. Do y'all have any thoughts on that? And I can kind of repeat this question, but thinking about these risk factors, right? And thinking about these protective factors, how can we then use these values centered by emergent spaces to create a more comprehensive and better bystander model? Does anyone have any thoughts on that? Let me check the chat because, like I said, sometimes for some reason the chat does not pop up for me. Any thoughts? And also, again, if anyone wants to, feel free to also unmute and so I can't see the chat, but where my mind is going with this is just the idea of, again, if we know that a lack of empathy, for example, is a risk factor, then we can go back and think, okay, how do we build empathy? Well, first of all, that starts from a really young age, but also it starts from shifting culture, right? And it starts with accountability, and it starts with love. I think it starts with love really being the centering factor in a lot of our community, to be like, we are acting on behalf of someone out of love, out of accountability. And so really centering that as a value, I think, is super, super important in terms of really centering empathy in these sorts of spaces and in these models, and just in general. Okay, I think I see something in the chat. It seems hard for people to practice interdependence when there's a lack of trust or even knowing a community. Yes, absolutely. I agree. And so again, building that trust, finding ways to, before you even create spaces, building trust within communities is so, so important. And I think we can start making those shifts, right? We can start making those shifts. I don't think the expectation is to just have a complete community where we all just trust each other and that's going to happen right in the next day. You're absolutely right that takes time, that takes work. And so that's kind of the purpose of us doing the individual work too, to try and, do the self work so that we can build fruitful and meaningful relationships with others that, aren't based on harm or aren't based on a lot of the normalized practices that we're so used to, right?
And Shireen, you know where I'm going with this. I want you to give us unpack a little bit, because you were able to do this for us this summer when you were at the virtual YI. Like, tell us how you taught the young people about love. And I will say, like, when Shireen unpack that for them, they had never thought of love in that regard. So I do want you to share a little bit about your perspective and thought processes on love.
Right. Yeah, thank you, Tracy, for that. I definitely think that for me, love has just never even really been centered in conversation or as just a value in anything that I've done, whether that be like an organization or even in school, which is kind of sad to think about now. But actually, I really started challenging the way I thought about love when I read All About Love by Bell Hooks over the summer. And that really is what started changing my thinking, and kind of just understanding that love, for example, is an action, and it's not an emotion. I think we're so socialized to believe that, we have to lead with love in our emotions and feelings, which there's nothing wrong with that inherently, but I believe that love really shows up in action. And so in knowing that we can hold each other accountable, that is an action, right, of love. And I think so a lot of folks, when they hear accountability, that kind of comes with a negative connotation, or at least that's what my experience has been. When people hear about accountability, it's like, no, I don't want to be held accountable. I mean, I get that, right? Because that's what society and culture perpetuates. And so moving away from that, though, and understanding that actually holding each other and ourselves especially accountable is an act of love. It's an act of making sure, we are on a path that's not going to be harmful neither to ourselves or to others, and that we're on a path where we can actually continue to grow and be supported and have that kind of community, right? And so I think shifting the way we talk about accountability, especially as it relates to love, is something that's so, so important. And it's something that I think gets completely lost or even just not even mentioned in a lot of conversations as we're talking about accountability, as we're talking about empathy and community and the importance of all of that. Yes, accountability is love. I finally got the chat open. Thank y'all for, again, being so patient with me. I just want to make sure that I'm reading what folks are saying, because everyone's thoughts are so valued in this space and appreciated. It seems hard for people to practice yeah, definitely. I love the concept of emergent space, but I wonder how we can convince folks in a patriarchal society to be less independent and more interconnected and empathetic, especially members of the dominant culture. Wow, yeah, that is a powerful thought. Does anyone have any thoughts in regards to Sharika's comment there? How do we do that, right? I think that brings a valid point too, right, Sharika, that a lot of the time, right, again, it's falling upon, you know, maybe more marginalized identities and marginalized folks to actually come up with these frameworks, to come up with these ways of thinking, right? Because we understand that the way it is now does not serve us, right? But it is hard when you start to think, for the folks who are in the dominant culture, that maybe some of these norms do serve them. Then how do you kind of cope with that? How do you come to terms with understanding, you know, maybe this is serving me, but it's not really serving others. And I think just even in that sentence itself, if folks really did center empathy and really did center love and understand that they would know that if something is serving me, but however, at the expense of someone else or a whole other group of people, then there must be a better way. There must be a more solution-oriented way. There must be a way to decentralize and to make big cultural shifts and changes so that, you know, there is a more, I guess, interdependent and community-like structure. But I think there's a lot of things that has to, you know, happen and go on with that. I mean, even in my political science brain, I'm thinking of nationalism, I'm thinking of borders, I'm thinking of all of the ways in which we divide ourselves and all of the social constructs that we create that ends up building way more walls than they ever do build community, right? But I think onto that point, something that I at least tell myself, because I think, you know, I think it's important to acknowledge, right, that we are in a patriarchal society, and we are in a very nuclear, individualistic kind of, that is really the dynamic that I think is perpetuated and normalized in our culture. But I think that even just the resistance on an individual level to say, I'm not with that, you know, I'm not doing that, and I'm not going to perpetuate that in my life, nor am I going to perpetuate it in my work. Imagine if the head of a nonprofit were to do that, right? Imagine if two heads of a nonprofit were able to do that. And so that kind of goes back to, right, this fractal nature of creating small shifts, creating community-based, community organizing, mutual aid, grassroots-based shifts that can actually create exactly those ripple effects onto the larger culture, onto the larger society. That maybe they're not there yet, but we are doing the individual work we know that's necessary to start getting there. So yeah, very great thoughts. Thank you so much for that thought and question. It's so important. But yeah, with that, we're honestly, to end on a more hopeful note, right, on to some action steps. Like, what can we actually do? What can we take away? What are some things we can apply? Well, first, I would say, if you haven't read Emergent Strategy, please do. This is, again, what it looks like. One of my favorite books ever, if not my favorite. It has a lot more tools and, in terms of even just self-reflection and thinking about organizing in groups, thinking about really what Sharika mentioned, which is the societal. How are we going to do this on society? Because surely emergent spaces, I think, focuses more on group and individual-based settings, whereas, you know, emergent strategy as a whole focuses more on that organizational/societal level change. Another action step could be to encourage your attendees to think about how they're going to show up to the space, right? That can be maybe iterating, what are our mission? What is our values? How are we all going to come together and commit to the same mission and values? And how does our individual role contribute to that collective goal or space or value or mission? Supporting folks in creating action plans, right? So this framework probably wouldn't have been be possible, right, if I didn't have the support that I had from Tracy, from Chris, from Montia, from NCCASA, right? So inherently that support, that interdependence on one another is what can lead to creating more possibilities and what can create this action, right? Me personally, I mentioned this before, but as a student, especially as a student at a university, right, that I think maybe perpetuates a lot of, you know, these norms and stuff, which I think a lot of universities do and institutions. That's the reality of the world. I didn't even realize it was possible for me to even create anything of my own, or to have even original thoughts, right? Up to a certain point, I feel like I was just being fed information for so long without ever challenging it. And I was just taught to absorb it, and whoever can absorb it the best is the smartest and the most brilliant. But what I realized is really actually pushing people and challenging people, and then further supporting people to realize that they too can create action, that they too have a hand, right, and a responsibility in these shifts is super, super important and empowering. Another thing is just encouraging folks to invite a friend or two, like whenever you come to a training like this, right? Or whenever you hold a space that might be more intentional or emergent, think of the folks you can bring into that space. Think of the folks who might not traditionally be in that space and think of how you can pull them in. And lastly, think about how you can practice community accountability, especially, like I said, in bite-sized pieces. And like I said, accountability is hard, right? Because we're really not taught it. We're not told to practice it. I think a lot of the time, again, it's just a negative almost. And so thinking about first, how am I going, if you're someone who maybe is new to some of this, thinking, how am I going to start holding myself accountable before I even start thinking of holding my work partner accountable or my friend accountable? I think it starts on an individual level of how am I going to hold myself accountable, for example, to not cause harm in the space, or to come to this space prepared to have such and such conversation, right? And so these are just a few of the many, right, action steps and more possibilities I think that can be created out of this framework. And so I just encourage each and every one of y'all to think about your own action steps and hold space for your own reflections on how you can potentially apply emergent space and all of the things we talked about today to your own respective spaces and lives. But with that, that is essentially the end of this presentation. And I would love any questions if folks have any. I'm gonna stop share. Hi, Montia.
Hey y'all, how are you doing?
Doing well. Yes, I just wanted to, we just finished like the bulk of the major presentation, but I do want to give you a shout out and introduce y'all to everyone. Montia is my lovely co-author that I've had the pleasure of both working with and being close to. And so I'm delighted that she was able to come. We are in our first week of class, so things are a little bit hectic and we are like in class, in Zoom, trying to shift, but I'm so glad that you could come to the space.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for introducing me. I hope y'all love the presentation. I know Shireen did so well, so I'm excited to hear any questions y'all have. I know Shireen did a great presentation.
Oh, thank you, Montia.